Welcome to the podcast, Let the Prophet Speak. Today we are continuing our study of chapter 23 of the second book of Kings, that is Melachim Bet, Perek Chav Gimel. We are at Pasuk Daled, that is verse 4. And we have just read that after a Sefer Torah, a Torah scroll, was found by the Kohanim, by the priests in the Holy Temple, and it was read to King Josiah, and he read in there the punishments that awaited the people if they were not faithful to God and they continued their worship of idols, and how in order to gain the favor of God they would need to completely change paths. And after this reading and interpretation of the Torah scroll was confirmed by Huldah, the prophetess, by Huldah, who declared that it was indeed God's intention to destroy the Beit HaMikdash, to destroy the temple, and exile the people as a result of their errant ways. So Yeshayahu took action. He read this to the people in public, and we're about to start reading what was the actions that he took. And we're going to see a systematic destruction of all idols and all remnants of idol worship. And here we go, verse 4. Vayetzav HaMelech es Chilkiyahu HaKohen HaGadol. The king commanded Chilkiyahu, the high priest, v'et Kohanei HaMishnah, and the assistant priests, v'et Shomrei Asaf, and those that guarded the entranceways to the temple. Lo'otzi meheichal Adonai, he commanded them to remove from the temple of God, et kol hakelim, all of the vessels ha'asuyim laBaal that were made in honor of the Avodah Zarah, the idol of Baal, familiar Canaanite Avodah Zarah, that idol that has come up quite a few times during the previous several hundred years of the people of Israel in the land. V'lo Asherah, and anything that was made for the Asherah, which is another Avodah Zarah, another idol, which is generally considered to be some sort of female consort god to God himself, which is obviously against everything the Torah stands for. And this Asherah, he commanded they remove those vessels as well. And things that were made in honor of all the hosts of the heaven by Yisrafim, and he burnt them michutz liYerushalayim b'shadmot Kidron. He burnt them outside Jerusalem on the slopes that led down towards the Kidron Valley. V'nasa et afaram Beit El, and he had their dust brought to Beit El. Beit El is the site of the temple that were built by Yeravam, by Jeroboam the first, way back in the beginning of the split of the kingdom. And those were representative of pure impurity and idolatry. It was a perfect place to dump this contaminated, disgusting waste. V'hishbises akmarim, and he ended the reign of the priests, asher nasnu malchei Yehuda, that the previous kings of Judah had placed, in other words, had placed in positions. These are the previous kings, meaning his father Ammon and his grandfather Menashe. That what did they do? Kater babamot b'arei Yehuda, and they were appointed to burn incense on the high places in the cities of Judah, Misibei Yerushalayim, and the surrounding cities of Jerusalem, v'etam mikatrim laBaal, and those priests that had been put in charge of being mikater, of bringing incense to the Baal, to that idol, v'lashemesh, and the sun that was being worshipped, v'lereach, and the moon that was being worshipped, v'lemazalot, and the constellations that were being worshipped, v'lchotz v'ashamayim, and all of the heavenly bodies. Vayotzei ha'asherah mibeit Adonai, and he removed the Asherah idol from the house of God, michutz Yerushalayim, he brought it outside the city of Jerusalem, el nachal Kidron, to the wadi of Kidron, the Kidron stream. Vayisrof osa benachal Kidron, and he burnt it there. Vayadek la'afar, and he crushed it into dirt. Vayashlech et afara al kever b'nei ha'am, and he sprinkled and spread the dust over the graves of the common folk that had been buried there. Vayitotzet potei kedeshim, and he knocked down and he took down the houses of the kedeshim, generally considered to be male prostitutes, asher beveis Adonai, that had been put up in the house of God, asher hanoshim orgos sham batim lo asherah, and in those houses as well, women would weave coverings for the Asherah. Got rid of that. Vayaveat kol hakohanim me'orei haYehuda, and he brought all of the priests from the towns of Judah, vayitamei et habamot, and he defiled and ruined, took down, in other words, the bamot, the altars, the high places, asher kitru sham hakohanim, where these priests were there bringing incense. This was incense for God, but outside the Beit HaMikdash, which was wrong, and we had discussed this many times, that the bamot were places where people were worshiping God, but as we know from the Torah, this is something forbidden. The only place where altars belong is in the holy temple itself, and that's it. So he took these priests that were in these outlying altars and brought them back in. And he destroyed the bamot that remained at the gates. Apparently there were altars at the gates to the city, asher petach shar Yoshua Sara'ir, which were at the opening of the gate of Joshua, who was the mayor of the city. Asher al smol ish b'shar ha'ir, which was at the left side of the city gate. So apparently people, when entering the city, they might bring a sacrifice there, or when leaving the city, they might bring a sacrifice there to pray for safety on the road, or some kind of sacrifice to the city. He destroyed that as well. However, lo yalu kohanei bamot el mizbachat Yerushalayim. These priests that had served on these bamot were no longer allowed. They were not allowed to bring sacrifices on the altar of God in Yerushalayim in Jerusalem. Because they had served in places where they should not have been serving, they were not allowed to serve in the Beit HaMikdash, in the temple. Ki im achlu matzot b'toch achayim. However, they were allowed to eat the matzot, the portions of the karbanot mincha, of the grain offerings that were baked into matzot, baked into crackers. They were allowed to partake of those portions, but they were not allowed to partake in the service itself. V'timeat hatofet, and he also timei defiled or ruined the tofet. The tofet is generally considered the just using the translation of Rashi here, the tofet is the worst of all, the abominable idol called Molech, to which the human sacrifices were brought, the child sacrifices were brought. And Rashi explains that it was called tofet because they would beat drums during the ceremony in order to drown out the sounds of the screaming children as they were being sacrificed. Asher begei ben Hinnom, that was in the place of Gei ben Hinnom, the valley of Ben Hinnom, which earned its terrible, terrible name. Gei ben Hinnom being a name generally used for hell itself, because of the hellish child sacrifice that took place in this valley. Livilti, and he removed this whole apparatus of idol worship in order that no one would ever anymore so no one would ever any longer bring his child, his son or his daughter in fire as an offering to Molech, to the god called Molech. Vayashbeit et hasusim asher natnu malchei Yehuda lashemesh mibo beit Adonai. And there were horses that the kings of Judah had given as some sort of a gift to those who worshipped the sun, right? As they came to the house of God. If you imagine the modern Temple Mount, people coming from the Mount of Olives up the slopes to the east side, that's where the sun would rise into that gate, and people coming into that gate would worship the sun. And apparently they brought horses there and gave it to the people or something. Elishkat Nisan Melech Hasoris, he took the horses away and gave them to the in Nitan Melech, that's which is the name of a room where the Saris, where the king's assistant, Asher Parvorim, which was in the areas of Parvor, is an area outlying the city, sometimes translated as a suburb, Viet Markavot Hashemesh, and the chariots of the sun, Saraf Ba'eshi, burned in fire. So apparently part of the sun worship was these horses and chariots were somehow given over to the sun worship, so he got rid of them. So again, this program of eliminating all of the vestiges of idol worship. asher al hagog aliyat achaz, and the altars that were on the top of the upper chamber of Achaz. Achaz is his grandfather, right? The king who was steeped in idol worship. Asher asu malchei Yehuda, that the previous kings of Judah had made. They had built these altars on the roof of the upper story of the palace. He got rid of those. V'etam mizbechot asher asam Menashe, and one wonders why these altars were not removed by Chizkiyahu, who had also had a similar program, but not quite as extensive. Apparently, for some reason, they were not removed then. But because Achaz was Chizkiyahu's father, that would have been his the great grandfather of Yoshiyahu. But he also removed the Mizbechot Asher Asam Menashe, that Menashe, his grandfather, had made Bishtei Chatzrot Beit Adonai, in the two Chatzrot, in the two courtyards of the house of God, presumably meaning the courtyard of the Yisrael, meaning the outer courtyard in which the large altar where the sacrifices were brought, and then the inner courtyard where the menorah and the shulchan, the table, the showbread table was on. In that room, the inner courtyard. So apparently Menashe had built Mizbechot altars there. Natatz HaMelech, the king, destroyed and smashed Vayaratz Misham, and he rushed them out of there, or knocked them down out of there. V'hishlichet afaram el Nachal Kidron, and he threw their ashes into the Wadi Kidron. V'et bamot asher al pnei Yerushalayim, and all of the bamot, all of the altars that were built around the city facing Jerusalem, asher mimin lahar hamashchit, asher, which were to the right of the har hamashchit, which can be mentioned, the mountain of destruction, which is identified traditionally as the name being used for the Mount of Olives. That, in other words, when it's being used in a positive way, it's called Har HaZeitim, Mount of Olives. But in this case, because of all the idol worship that had taken place there, right, these are it's now being called the Har HaMashchit, the mountain of destruction, or the mountain of things that cause destruction or corruption, things that cause the corruption and destruction to happen. And what were these? Asher Bana Shlomo Melech Yisrael, that's Shlomo, Solomon, the king of Israel, had built Li Ashtoret. Remember, in the end of his life, Shlomo had built, or at least allowed for the building of all of these idols, of temples and altars to various idols, that Shlomo had allowed them because of all of his wives that were continuing to worship as they had done in the places and the countries where they had come from. We had discussed that back in the first book of Kings, which was at the end of Shlomo's career. So now those were still standing, apparently, and many of them on the Har HaZeitim, on the Mount of Olives. So these were built Li Ashtoret, to the god of Ashtoret, who was Shikutz Tzidonim, who is the Shikutz, the disgusting idol of the Sidonese, right, the people from Sidon, Tzidon, a city which is now in modern Lebanon. V'lichmosh, and Chemosh, who we've come across several times in the book of Judges, who is Shikutz Moav, who was because remember, Solomon had married women from Tzidon, from Sidon, had married women from Shikutz Moav, from the people of the Moabites. Then Chemosh was their god, Milkom, and Milkom, who was Toavat Bnei Ammon, who was the abomination of the descendants of Ammon. Tzimei HaMelech, the king, defiled all of them and took them all down. V'shibarat hamatzivot, he knocked down their pillars, in other words, the monuments built to these gods. V'yechroses asherim, and he cut down the asherim, it would seem like every god had its Asherah, had its female consort version. So God Himself, Lahavdil, people had an Asherah built in the temple itself, and of course that violates every principle of the Torah, which is why we learned several verses ago that Yoshiyahu, that was one of the first things he ripped out, and he also ripped out the Asherim that were built to accompany these other gods, the gods of Ammon and Moab and so on, which were still being worshipped by their various cults. Vayimalei mekomam atzmot adam, and he filled their place with human bones. So this is the traditionally it's understood that these human bones were buried from the burial places of the people that had worshipped. So the people had worshipped these gods and had themselves buried near those temples, and then he uprooted all of those bones and threw them into the temples that had been destroyed. Similar to today, where people often are buried near a place of worship, to be close to a holy place. Well, in those days, those people that lived their lives worshiping these idols wanted to be buried near their idols, and he took those bones and threw them in there. At least that's how this is traditionally understood. So now Yoshiyahu goes to the northern kingdom. Remember, the northern kingdom at this point had been destroyed as a political entity, and the way we explained and understood, and it's going to be obvious in many cases, soon, and we'll see that the masses of the people of the north had, as we mentioned in the time of Hezekiah, many had run as refugees from the Assyrian onslaught and settled in the southern kingdom. And archaeologically, there's solid evidence that during the time of Hezekiah and his forefather Achaz and his father Achaz, that the population of the southern kingdom swelled, and there's good reason and archaeological evidence to support that these were refugees running from the northern kingdom. So the people of Judah are a mix of the refugees from the northern kingdom, but many remained in the northern kingdom and ended up, and we studied that several chapters ago as well, and started mixing with the people who had been resettled there by Assyria, and they had like a jumbled religion mixed of some Jewish elements and some foreign elements, a little bit of belief in God and a little bit of belief in these idols, etc. And this was going on. So the Israelites still resided there. So Yoshiyahu was still concerned about the fate of these cousins up north. And he went up north to Beit El, and these temples were still operating. So he went there, even though this really wasn't technically part of his jurisdiction, but he did. The Assyrians at this time were weak, and the area up north was kind of a free-for-all. So he went to the Mizbeach, the altar that was in Beit El, Habama Asher Asay Yeravam ben Nevat, to the altar that had been built by Jeroboam ben Nevat Asher Hechti Yisrael, the one who led the people of Israel into sin. Gam et hamizbeach hahu v'et habama notot. He destroyed that altar and the bama, the high place. Vayisrof et habama hedak lofar v'soraf asherah, and he burnt the bama, ground it to dirt, and he burnt the Asherah, the consort goddess that was up there, paired with that bama. And then Vayifen Yoshiyahu turned Vayar, and he saw et hakvarim asher sham bahar, the burial places that were there on the mount. If we go way back to the time of Yeravam, we remember the prophet that was sent by God to Yeravam to warn him to desist and to cease and desist from building this temple. And Yeravam, of course, ignored him. And on his way out, if you recall, he was met by a false prophet. There were these graves there, and the false prophet was buried together with the true prophet of God. That story goes way back in history to the time when the people were, when the two kingdoms split from each other, in those early days of the northern and southern kingdoms. He saw those burial places. So this is kind of just giving you like a reminiscence of the history of all of the mistakes, all of the things that have been happening all over these centuries, several centuries. And he took the bones out of these graves, and he burnt them upon the altar, and thus defiled the altar. Kidvar Adonai, as just like the word of God, Asher Kara Isha Elohim, that the man of God had said, Asher Karat Dvarim Ha'ela, that he predicted these events, that they were going to occur. And that was, of course, the bones of the false prophet that were there, but of the true prophet he had turned. Vayomer Mahat Zion Halaz. What is this monument? Asher Ani Ro'eh, that I see. Vayomer Elav. Tradition has it that this particular monument was in good condition, while the other one had thorns and weeds growing all over it. Vayomer Elav Anshe Ha'ir, and the people of the city of Beitel said, HaKever Isha Elim Asher Ba Yehuda. This is the grave of the man of God that came from Judah. Vayikra et Dvar Ma'ela Asher Asisa Al Mizbeach Beit El. And he predicted these things, that one day this was going to happen to the altar of Beit El. Just here you have a time way at the end of the history. The history of the northern kingdom had completely collapsed. And here is Yoshiyahu digging up, or identifying the grave, the monument of the one who tried to stop all this. Unsuccessfully, tragically, tried to stop all of this. Vayomer, and Yoshiyahu said, Hanichulo, leave that person there, let him rest in peace. Ish al yonah atzmosav, do not move his bones. Vayamaltu atzmosav, and they left his bones at Atzmos hanavi asher ba mishamron. And they let his bones lie there together with the bones of the other prophet that came from Shomron. So this was it's just a sad reminiscence of the times when people tried. They could have turned people in the right direction, but unfortunately it didn't happen. V'gamet kol botea bamot, and all of the holy, holy with a small h, places of those high places, Asher Bi'arei Shomron, which were scattered throughout the cities of Samaria, Asher Asu Malchei Yisrael, that the kings of Israel had made lahachis, in order to make God angry, or in such a way that God became angry. Heisir Yoshiyahu removed them. Vayaslem k'chol ha'ma'asim asher aso b'Beit El. So not only did he cleanse Judah, but he cleansed Israel. Vayizbach et kol kohanei ha'bamot asher sham al ha'mizbachot. Here, these were altars built for avodah zarah, for idol worship, and he executed all of the kohanim, all of the priests of these high places. Vayisrof et atzmos adam alehem, and he burnt them upon those altars. Vayashav Yerushalayim, and he came back to Jerusalem. So this differed from the treatment of the priests of the bamot that were dedicated to God. They were no longer allowed. They were not executed. They were no longer allowed to perform service of being a kohen. They were only allowed to partake in the portions that of the sacrifices along with their brethren, the priests. However, the ones that were priests to the avodah zarah, to the idols, they were executed. So this is what Yoshiyahu did, trying to cleanse the land of idol worship. An extremely aggressive campaign, an extremely thorough campaign. Nothing was left. We've seen kings before. We've seen Uzziyahu, we see Yotam, we saw Chizkiyahu, we saw Asa, we saw other kings in the past that tried and attempted to reduce or eliminate idol worship from the people. But none of them were nearly as we can see, many houses of idol worship remained, including the ones built in the times of Solomon. So no one was nearly as extensive and as thorough as Yoshiyahu was until now in just ridding the people of the scourge of idol worship. So this will conclude this portion of chapter 23. Thank you so much for studying this together with me. Looking forward to studying the rest of this chapter and, of course, the rest of the book of Kings together. Have a wonderful day.